Hello, I'm your moderator, Hee Jong-son, a research professor of Center for Cross-Cultural Studies at Kyung University, and welcome the 11th and the last session of the 99th International Conference of Deleuze and Guattari Studies in Asia. We have some technical problems here, but still really nice to meet you all. And it is actually my first time to participate this fabulous conference. And I found the universe of Deleuze and Guattari is very broad, profound, and contemporary, of course. Actually, no need to mention, but I want to express my gratitude for the organizers and the participants. This session will be presented by three philosophers, Paul Patton, Geoff Bradley, and Ermin Gogol. And now we move on to presenter, Dr. Paul Patton. Here. Okay. Dr. Paul Patton is a professor of philosophy in Wuhan University and a philosopher with an international reputation in social and political philosophy and continental philosophy. He is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and has served on the Council of Australasian Association of Philosophy and the Executive Committee of the Australasian Society for Continental Philosophy. He has endless list of publications, so I'm gonna mention only two of them, the sole authored books. One is Deleuze and the Political, which has been translated into Korean, Spanish, Persian, and Mandarin. And at 2010, he published Deleuzian Concept, Philosophy, Colonization, Politics. I'm looking forward to read that too. Today, Dr. Paul Patton will give us a talk titled Deleuze, Hume and Democracy, Institutions versus Constitutions. Looking forward to it too. Professor Paul Patton, now floor is all yours.
Thank you, and my apologies for the mix-up before. After seamlessly joining from the link in the program today, it decided to ask me for a code to log in. So I'm just trying to share screen with my PowerPoints. Right. Yep. Okay. Is that visible?
No, not yet.
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let's try.
Yeah, you have to share it.
Yeah. Okay. How's that? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now you're able to share it.
So, sorry, is it visible now, or is it?
Not yet.
Okay.
One needs to be made co-host. Who's in charge?
Is made co-host.
Yeah.
Oh, try again. I think actually
Okay.
system changed. Okay.
Yeah. Could you put the share button and then?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Good.
It's on.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. Good. Apologies for the technical mishaps. It's been working seamlessly, but of course it doesn't today. So thanks to the organizers, I'll go straight to my talk, which is about Deleuze, Hume and Democracy. So the origins of this presentation lie in a problem of interpretation in relation to Deleuze's political philosophy. So as everyone knows, in What is Philosophy and related writings, like his 1990 interview with Antonio Negri, Deleuze is very critical of modern liberal democracies. They're described as models of realization of the axiomatic of capitalism. They're charged with complicity in the generation and maintenance of poverty alongside great wealth. The shame of being human that Primo Levi spoke about in relation to the Holocaust is also experienced as a result of the meanness and vulgarity of existence that haunts democracies. At the same time, Deleuze suggests in What is Philosophy that one of the potential pathways to another society and another people is a becoming democratic that is not reducible to or not the same as the workings of constitutional states, he says on page 113. So this apparent endorsement of becoming democratic raises the question, what exactly is meant by this phrase? What does Deleuze mean? What is the content of becoming democratic? So one way to answer this question, and it's a way that I have pursued in earlier writings, is to refer to the democratic ideals affirmed by those existing liberal democratic states, the commitment to equality, the idea that all should be represented in the political institutions and decisions of government, the idea of the will of the people, and the idea that decisions should reflect the interests of all of the people. So becoming democratic would then involve the criticism of existing states in the light of these principles, along with efforts to address the ways in which existing states fall short of their proclaimed ideals. So this would in effect be to treat becoming democratic as a matter of political jurisprudence, as seeking to extend the constitutional and legal conditions under which the ideals of democracy are implemented. And understood in this way, becoming democratic presupposes the existence of the constitutional state and the rule of law. It relies on the existence of sovereign legal power in order to extend and further entrench the impact of democratic principles on the social body. So there is, to say the least, a tension between this way of understanding becoming democratic and Deleuze's suggestion that the concept or the process of becoming democratic is not reducible to the workings of constitutional states. Deleuze's earlier work suggested a different approach. So in response to Negri's opening question in the interview that I mentioned earlier, Deleuze says that he was always interested in collective creations rather than representations. And by collective creations, he means social institutions that form and are transformed. He says in that interview with Negri, there's a whole order of movement in institutions that is independent of both laws and contracts. And as he explains, his interest in social institutions was first developed in his work on Hume, in whom he says he found a creative concept of institutions and law. So on Deleuze's account of Hume rejected the idea at the heart of the social contract tradition, according to which the establishment of stable political social order, was the result of an agreement, a contract to establish some form of sovereign power with the capacity to make and to enforce law. As Deleuze says in the quote on the slide, the fault of contractual theories is that they present us with a society whose essence is the law, that is, with a society which has no other object than to guarantee certain pre-existing natural rights and no other origin than the contract. So for Hume, according to Deleuze, the essence of society is not the law, but the institution. And the difference is that whereas law and sovereign political power function primarily to limit what people and government may do, the institution is not a limitation, but rather a model of actions, a veritable enterprise, an invented system of positive means or a positive invention of indirect means. That's from Empiricism and Subjectivity. And by way of an illustration, Deleuze refers to Hume's theory of the institution of promising. So on Hume's account, in the treatise of Human Nature, the rule of morality that tells us to honor promises is not a natural, but an artificial rule. Intelligible, unintelligible, Hume says, quoting him, before human conventions had established it. So for Hume, promises are human inventions, or as he later says, artificial contrivances for the convenience and advantage of society. And they acquire their specific force, not simply from the fact that they express a resolution to perform some act or service to another, but from the fact that they involve a form of words, the purpose of which is to assure others that we can be relied on. So someone who uses the relevant form of words, I promise, in Hume's words, subjects himself to the penalty of never being trusted again in case of failure. In this way, the use of a form of words that amounts to promising creates a new interest and motive on the part of the one promising. As Hume says, whoever uses them, these words, is immediately bound by his interest to execute his engagements and must never expect to be trusted anymore if he refused to perform what he promised. So the institution of promising takes hold because it's apparent that it provides a benefit to all. Once established, it is an institution that establishes a private interest in acting in a manner that serves the public interest. The utility of each in this way is bound to the utility of all. Now, Hume offers a parallel account of the origin of the institutions of justice and government, which I'll briefly summarize. Justice, he argues, is a human invention designed to address the serious challenges to the stability of society that is posed by the ease with which individuals can appropriate the property of others, the external property of others, its ease of transferability, and challenge to the stability posed by the interests and passions that impel people to do this. Having already argued that society is necessary for human well-being and that it serves this end by facilitating the increase and improvement of property, Hume notes that instability of possession is one of the main threats to society, and the remedy consists in ensuring stability of possession by artificial means. This can be done, he says, in no other manner than by a convention entered into by all the members of society to bestow stability on the possession of those external goods. The bases of this convention for Hume are the same passions and interests that motivate individuals to try to appropriate the property of others, namely self-interest and partiality, or as he calls it, limited generosity of humankind in favor of their family and friends. The individual realizes that it will be in her or his interest to respect the property of others, provided that they do the same with regard to her or his property. Moreover, abstaining from interference in the property of others serves the public interest of stability and commerce. This regulation of individual actions in the light of perceived common interest may properly be called a convention or agreement, he says, even though no explicit promise was made and even though it took hold only slowly. Quote from Hume, "Two men who pull the oars of a boat do it by an agreement or convention, though they have never given promises to each other. In like manner," he says later, "are languages gradually established by human conventions without any promise." So this conventional restraint in regard to the property of others is the basis of our ideas of justice and injustice, our notions of property, right and obligation. On Hume's account, property is nothing more than the sum total of goods, he says, whose constant possession is established by the laws of society, that is, by the laws of justice. So the same convention, according to Hume, give rise to laws of justice and property, and for this reason, he later concludes that the origin of justice lies in that selfishness and confined generosity of mankind, along with the scanty provision nature has made for his or her wants. So if justice and the stability of property are conditions for the existence of society, government and the rule of law is a no less necessary condition for maintaining it. Hume argues that nothing is more certain than that people are governed by their interests, and nothing serves their interests more than, as he puts it, a universal and inflexible observance of the rules of justice, which is the only means by which they can preserve society and keep themselves from falling into that wretched and savage condition known as the state of nature. However, people don't always act in accordance with their interests, and Hume argues that the passions that impel us to action are also affected by the imagination, which is more strongly affected by that which is closest to us in time and space. So for this reason, he argues, people may be led to act in favor of immediate or short-term advantage rather than their known interest, which always includes the observance of principles of justice. And this in turn encourages others to act unjustly by that dynamic that Hobbes also identified. No one wants to be the idiot observing the rules of justice when others are not. So others are encouraged to act unjustly, and as a result, social relations in general tend to become dangerous and uncertain. So the only remedy for this state of affairs, on Hume's account, is government, which is established when some for whom observing the laws of justice is their most immediate interest, and the violation of those laws, their most remote interests, these few are appointed to carry out and maintain those laws of justice. And this is the long passage on the slide, which I won't read in full, but I'll come back to it. So these same persons appointed to execute and maintain the laws of justice in relation to property, Hume goes on to say, are also appointed to decide controversies between citizens, between the governed, so that all behave equitably toward one another and peace is maintained. And he says further things about the role of government in coordinating activities and enterprises, but we don't need to go into those. So to come back a little to the question with which I started, government and democracy in Hume and in Deleuze. For Hume, government is clearly a human invention and therefore an institution, but it's democratic only in the very broad sense that the rules of justice and the institution of promising are also democratic, namely that it acts upon the interests of all those governed in order to preserve their common interest. And indeed, on Hume's account, it's precisely because it is non-democratically composed that government is able to do this. Government achieves its purpose because it's composed of a privileged few, he says in that quote above, who have no interest or but a remote one in any act of injustice, and being satisfied with their present condition and with their part in society, have an immediate interest in every execution of justice. So Hume's account of the origins of government doesn't take us very far in answering that question with which I started about the meaning of Deleuze's becoming democratic. We can appreciate the difference between thinking of government as an institution or convention and thinking, as Hume did, and thinking of government as Locke did, as an authority established by agreement or contract in order to better enforce the laws of nature. For Hume, there are no laws of nature, only institutions arrived at by convention over time, like promises, the institution of promising and the rules of property. Government is a further institution that establishes a rule of law, but as I've already suggested, Hume was no radical democrat. He strongly opposed all forms of direct democracy in favor of representative democracy with a substantial property qualification attached to the right to vote. And Hume also favored a two-tier electoral system that would ensure that lawmakers would be, as he put it, men of fortune and education. And his ideal commonwealth that he discusses in an essay of that name was designed to ensure stability and to ensure that the popular masses had no role in government beyond that of electing their betters, these men of fortune and education, to the representative assemblies that were the backbone of a well-governed state. So there remains only the broad sense in which Hume's conception of government and the allegiance owed to government by citizens could be called democratic, namely that these were grounded in the interest of all. His objection, Hume's objection to the Lockean idea that political obligation resulted from an implicit contract or promise in exchange for security and protection, was that Hume's objection was that the same conclusion could be drawn more directly without recourse to the intermediary idea of a promise. The source of obedience to government lies in the citizen's interest in security and protection, and as interest is, in Hume's words, the immediate sanction of government, once that interest is no longer met, so the obligation to obey government no longer holds. Hume draws here on a distinction between natural and moral obligation to argue, in fact, that the obligation to obey government, the moral obligation, may still carry weight even after the natural obligation has ceased. And this is because he argues human society is rule governed rather than subject to the vagaries of calculation on a particular occasion. The value of the general rule of obedience to government needs to be considered before taking the all-important decision to rebel or otherwise attempt to overthrow a government. But his underlying view remains that obedience or allegiance, as he puts it, is owed to governments on the basis of public interest, no more and no less. And to the extent that this ties political obligation to the interest of all, it is a democratic conception of government only in the very broadest sense of that term. turning back to Deleuze in his discussion, he notes that Hume's account of the origin of government identifies the source in human nature of the social disorder for which government provides a cure. It lies in the fact, as I mentioned, that people's passions are greatly affected by the strength of the ideas presented to the mind, and the fact that the ideas of objects close to us in time or space operate with more force than the ideas of more remote or obscure objects. And this explains why people act in ways that are opposed to their real and enduring interest. In particular, Hume suggests it explains why they prefer any trivial advantage that is present to the maintenance of order in society, which so much depends on the observation of justice. So people tend to prefer the contiguous over the remote, and as a result are easily led to violate the principles of justice in the pursuit of their own short-term gain. The solution to this problem, Hume says, is to be found in the same inclination that produces the disorder, namely people's tendency to prefer that which is more contiguous or immediate. A way must be found, Hume argues, to change the circumstances and situation of all such that the observance of the laws of justice becomes their nearest interest and their violation their most remote. And this is the role of magistrates and rulers, in other words, of law and government, to bring about this change of circumstance and situation. The possibility of government in the interest of justice, and therefore in the interest of all, Hume suggests, relies on this capacity of some to view things as though they were at a distance, and as a result to arrive at a more accurate judgment of their value. Quoting Hume, when we consider any objects at a distance, all their minute distinctions vanish, and we always give the preference to whatever is in itself preferable. The fact that there are some in society able to focus on the horizon, as it were, provides the nucleus of civil government. So in Empiricism and Subjectivity, Deleuze summarizes Hume as suggesting that artificial means must be found to make the nearest become the most distant, and the most distant the nearest. This is the meaning of government. And he cites Hume's assertion that since human beings cannot change their natures, all they can do is, quote, change their situation and render the observance of justice the immediate interest of some particular person, and its violation their most remote. And this long passage then on the slide, again, which I won't read out in detail, but simply note some of the key elements, namely Deleuze's comment that we find here the principle of all serious political philosophy. True morality doesn't involve changing human nature, but inventing artificial and objective conditions. This invention for Hume, as for the entire 18th century, is political. It's government, in other words. Interestingly, a version of this principle of all serious political philosophy, as Deleuze calls it, reappears in his response to the question posed by Claire Parnay in the section of their Abécédaire interview entitled J comme gauche. What does it mean for you to be de gauche? Parnay argues, on the left. And Deleuze's response amounts to a statement of his own political position. He suggests, firstly, that being on the left is not a matter of government, which is why there are no leftist governments. Rather, he says, it involves two things. First, it is, he says, a matter of perception. Being on the left is a matter of perceiving that which is furthest from oneself, that which is remote or on the horizon as that which matters or that which must be dealt with. It's a matter of perceiving the fact of injustice and the fact that it cannot, or rather should not, endure. Conversely, not being on the left is a matter of beginning with that which is closest to oneself and one's own interests, and assuming that this is what matters, what must be preserved, especially, Deleuze says, to the extent that one is privileged living in a rich country. So we could put this response in Humean terms by saying that for Deleuze, being on the left is a matter of perceiving injustice and being committed to its removal. But then it's not clear why being on the left is not a matter of government, or why there can be no leftist governments. And secondly, for Deleuze, being on the left is a problem of becoming, so never ceasing to become minoritarian, as he puts it. I won't summarize his view of minoritarian becoming, assuming that's familiar with it, but simply make the point that minoritarian becomings encompass the variety of ways in which individuals and groups not only fail to conform to what he calls the majoritarian standard, the average adult white heterosexual European male speaking a standard language, but they also challenge its priority or show how it could be different in one or other of its defining features. So these minoritarian becomings can be isolated individual endeavors, or they can be social movements, but it is primarily in the latter forms, social movements, that they can and do bring about changes in the majoritarian standard. It's not immediately obvious either how one could interpret this element of Deleuze's political philosophy in Humean terms, perhaps as a license for permanent but incremental social and political change in response to newly perceived injustices. And there are some commentators on Hume who see him, in the words of one of them, Neil MacArthur, as, quote, a reformer in tune with the overall progressive spirit of Enlightenment philosophy and committed to the criticism of prejudices and institutional structures that stand in the way of a better society, one that is marked by personal freedom, legal equality, limited state power, and open trade. But to come back to my question, what Deleuze means by democracy and becoming democratic. In a companion text to his book on Hume, namely the collection Instincts and Institutions, published in 1955, Deleuze builds on the Humean idea that the essence of society is not the law, but rather the institution, to propose a definition of democracy. And here is the passage from the introduction to Instinct and Institutions, the crucial part of which, having repeated this Humean view of the priority of institutions over law, he says, such a theory will afford us the following political criteria. Tyranny is a regime in which there are many laws and few institutions. Democracy is a regime in which there are many institutions and few laws. Oppression becomes apparent when laws bear directly on people and not on the prior institutions that protect them. So interestingly, this definition of democracy and tyranny doesn't come from Hume. So there is a question here about the role of other sources in Deleuze's account of the Humean theory of institutions. Some commentators suggest that he was influenced by the early 20th century French jurist responsible for developing an institutional theory of law, Maurice Harieu. But this definition of democracy itself in the passage, a regime in which there are many laws and few institutions, in fact, closely follows comments made by Saint-Just, the Jacobin leader of the French during the French Revolution, Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, in his fragments on the Republican institutions, which you can readily find online. Saint-Just actually talks about freedom, not democracy. So there are a lot of questions here about the other sources that Deleuze is drawing on in his account of Hume. And clearly I don't have time for a discussion of Harieu or Saint-Just, these topics for further research. But let me conclude with a suggestion in relation to Hume as to how we might understand this idea. So in the treatise, Hume doesn't say much about the institution that has become a central determinant of the interest and well-being of individuals, namely the market. His discussion of the origins of society and justice, as we've seen, turns on the stability of property and recognizes the need for rules to regulate the transfer of property. And implicit in his comments on the benefits of the transfer of property is the idea of market exchange, as he says in this passage. All this requires mutual exchange commerce. And it was, of course, during the 18th century that the regulation of markets became a recognized sphere of government activity, and that the market became the central institution of European and European-derived societies. Since then, 3 centuries of living with this phenomenon, the centrality of the market, has taught us that so far as the interest and well-being of individuals is concerned, there are more and less equitable ways in which the market may be established. The less equitable ways are those that treat the laws of property as sacrosanct and don't interfere with the highly unequal distribution of wealth and capital that results. Societies founded on this free and largely untrammeled operation of markets are then compelled to intervene after the fact in the distribution of income, access to basic social services, which implies many laws that bear directly on the actions of individuals and classes of individuals, a kind of tyranny in the term of Deleuze's definition. A more equitable way of dealing with the problem of inequality might involve a restructuring of the market so that the ownership of wealth and capital is far more widely distributed at the outset, before the fact, as it were, so that the resultant distribution of income would be less unequal. In this way, the operation of the market as institution might address much of the remaining inequality without the need for so many laws to institute taxes, establish wealth transfer, provide access to basic social services, and so on. So perhaps, and this is my concluding comment, perhaps this is the kind of response to global injustice and inequality that Deleuze has in mind when he suggests, in response to Patton, that being on the left is a matter, as he puts it, of finding arrangements, finding worldwide assemblages to deal with these problems, rather than a matter of law and government. Thanks.